The airplane shook as if the sky itself had grown furious with its presence. 231 people. That was all that separated Flight 943 of Azure Airlines from becoming just another tragic statistic on the early morning news broadcasts. 231 souls were suspended at 36,000 feet in the air, trapped inside a massive metal tube that had suddenly, inexplicably, forgotten how to fly. Down in Seat 7C, right next to the aisle, a young woman was peacefully sleeping through the initial turbulence. Her name was Daisy Barnes, and she was 25 years old, with chestnut brown hair tied into a loose, messy bun. She wore an oversized gray hoodie that swallowed her thin frame, faded sneakers that no longer had a definable color, and cheap wired headphones hanging loosely around her neck. If anyone had bothered to look at her in that precise moment, and nobody did, because people rarely paid attention to someone who looked like Daisy, they would have assumed she was a broke college student returning from a cheap backpacking trip. The flight had departed from London Heathrow just over 6 hours ago, bound for Chicago O'Hare International Airport in the United States. A completely routine journey that seasoned pilots often referred to as a walk in the park. The skies over the Atlantic had been remarkably clear, the winds surprisingly calm, and the direct route over the northeastern American seaboard promised an early arrival. Azure Airlines, a budget carrier that promised cross-continental travel for less, had packed the heavy aircraft until every single seat was occupied by a weary traveler. There were exhausted families dealing with fussy toddlers, anxious executives gripping leather briefcases, wandering tourists carrying overstuffed backpacks, and retired couples wearing comfortable sweaters and clutching thick paperback novels. Up in the very first row of the premium cabin, a man in a sharply tailored dark suit was speaking loudly into his satellite phone, as if the entire aircraft were his personal corner office. His name was Carter Brooks, and absolutely everything about his demeanor screamed immense wealth and untouchable privilege. The heavy gold watch gripping his wrist, the imported silk tie resting against his crisp shirt, the Italian leather shoes gleaming under the cabin lights, and the dismissive way he did not even glance at the flight attendant when she poured his sparkling water all painted a clear picture. Carter was the ruthless chief financial officer of Brooks Capital, one of the most aggressive investment funds operating out of downtown Chicago. He was traveling strictly to finalize the hostile acquisition of a sprawling luxury hotel complex near Lake Michigan, and for him, this flight was not a journey at all. It was merely a tedious formality, an irritating parenthesis of wasted time wedged between one high-stakes boardroom meeting and another. When Daisy had originally boarded the airplane dragging a battered canvas backpack held together by hand-stitched patches, Carter had looked at her for a fleeting moment, just a fraction of a second. In that single passing glance, Carter's expression had communicated absolutely everything. A silent, heavy contempt, the specific kind of judgment that requires no spoken words because the eyes deliver the insult perfectly. As Daisy shuffled past his spacious aisle seat, he had subtly leaned away from her, pulling his expensive jacket closer, as if poverty itself were an airborne disease. He immediately turned his attention back to his bright tablet, scrolling through financial graphs without giving her existence a second thought. Daisy had not said a single word in response. She was entirely accustomed to being invisible to men like him. She hailed from a family that had never known what a savings account looked like, growing up in Pikeville, a small, forgotten coal town tucked away in the deep mountains of eastern Kentucky. It was the kind of isolated rural place where everybody knew everybody else's business, and where holding on to big, ambitious dreams was generally viewed with deep, mocking suspicion. Her mother, Ivy, worked grueling hours cleaning corporate offices in the dead of night just to keep the lights on in their drafty trailer. Her father had died tragically when Daisy was only 11 years old, crushed in a horrific accident at a local metal fabrication plant that left her mother with a laughably small pension and a daughter filled with a quiet, burning rage. But despite the relentless hardship, Daisy possessed something that Carter Brooks's vast fortune could never purchase, and that her family's poverty could never completely destroy: a pure, unyielding obsession. For as long as she could remember, flying machines had hypnotized her completely. She did not merely point at the sky like other children and smile. She studied the aircraft, listening to their engines, learning to distinguish the distinct whine of a turboprop from the deep roar of a commercial jet engine long before she celebrated her 10th birthday. While her middle school classmates were busy taping colorful posters of pop singers to their bedroom walls, Daisy's cramped room was completely covered in complex cockpit diagrams, intricate aeronautical charts, and a painstakingly detailed cardboard model of an Embraer 190 that she had built from scratch. At the age of 17, her relentless studying earned her a modest scholarship to the prestigious Wright Brothers Aviation Academy up in Ohio. The financial aid was the bare minimum, barely covering tuition, but to Daisy, it was a golden ticket to a brand new life. Throughout her intense training years, she studied complex aerodynamics during the daylight hours and worked absolutely exhausting manual labor jobs when the sun went down. She scrubbed greasy hangar floors, served stale coffee at the aerodrome cafeteria, and pulled graveyard shifts at a desolate highway gas station every weekend. She survived on 4 hours of sleep a night, sometimes 3, but the moment she strapped into a flight simulator and wrapped her calloused hands around the yoke, every ounce of exhaustion vanished instantly. Up in the air, Daisy was no longer the desperately poor girl from the forgotten hills of Pikeville, Kentucky. Up in the air, she was exactly who she was always meant to be, graduating among the top 3 pilots of her entire class, being the only woman and the youngest student to ever achieve that honor. After finishing the academy, she spent nearly 3 years flying for a crumbling small-time cargo airline operating out of the frozen expanses of Alaska. She flew ancient, rattling airplanes on incredibly complicated routes, through brutally unforgiving weather systems. It was the purest form of old-school aviation, a harsh environment where no fancy computer autopilot could save you, where absolutely everything was accomplished with raw muscle on the controls and unblinking eyes scanning the mechanical dials. She had flown through blinding blizzards over the dark ocean, battled severe wing icing above jagged mountain peaks, and executed terrifying crosswind landings on impossibly short gravel runways that did not even exist on standard commercial maps. By the time she turned 25, she had accumulated just over 2,000 hours of actual flight time. It was not a massively spectacular number by commercial airline standards, but every single one of those hours had been hard-earned in deadly skies. There was no relaxed cruising under clear blue heavens. Every minute was fought for with her own 2 hands. And now, she was sitting quietly in seat 7C of a discount commercial flight, returning home after visiting her old retired flight instructor in London, who had shared some profound news that she was still trying to process mentally. She had buckled her seatbelt, pulled a heavily battered aerodynamics manual from her bag, and drifted off to sleep before the aircraft had even reached its cruising altitude. Meanwhile, up in the tightly secured cockpit, Captain David Foster, a seasoned veteran with more than 20 years of commercial airline experience, was calmly monitoring his pristine digital instruments. Beside him, co-pilot Frank Stevens, a bright young man only a few years older than Daisy, was casually joking about the upcoming weekend baseball games. Everything was perfectly normal until the first subtle shudder vibrated through the metal frame, and the main flight displays blinked out into total darkness. There is a highly specific, terrifying moment right before a massive disaster unfolds, where the human body instinctively knows what the rational mind has not yet accepted. Down in the cabin, Daisy felt a sudden, sickening pressure drop deep in the pit of her stomach, identical to the weightless sensation of an elevator dropping downward far too quickly. Her thin hands immediately shot out and gripped the plastic armrests of her seat with white-knuckled intensity. Her sharp eyes darted rapidly around the crowded passenger cabin, desperately seeking visual confirmation of the catastrophic event her highly trained senses were screaming about. To the untrained eye, everything still appeared perfectly serene and thoroughly normal. An elderly man across the aisle was casually flipping through a glossy travel magazine. Two teenagers seated directly in front of her were passing a glowing smartphone back and forth, giggling softly. An older woman was calmly knitting a long blue scarf. The crying baby back in row 12 had finally settled down and was happily sucking on a warm plastic bottle. Up in the very first row, Carter Brooks remained entirely absorbed by the glowing screen of his expensive tablet, acting as if the physical laws of the exterior world simply did not apply to a man of his incredible wealth. But Daisy knew the terrifying truth. The massive commercial aircraft was descending, and it was absolutely not a pre-programmed controlled descent. She swiftly pulled the cheap headphones from around her neck and shoved them deep into the front pocket of her oversized hoodie. She quietly closed the heavy aerodynamics manual that had been resting on her chest and stowed it carefully beneath the seat in front of her with slow, highly precise movements. She desperately wanted to avoid causing an immediate, uncontrollable panic among the surrounding passengers. First, she needed to completely understand the exact nature of the mechanical failure. She leaned slightly to her left and peered intensely out the scratched plastic window on the opposite side of the narrow aisle. The fluffy white clouds, which just a few short minutes ago had been far below the belly of the airplane, now appeared noticeably closer, rushing upward at an alarming speed. Furthermore, the subtle downward tilt of the aircraft's nose that she had felt upon waking up had not been corrected by the flight crew. If anything, the steep angle had grown at least 1 degree more pronounced. Her highly analytical mind instantly began calculating the terrifying mathematics of their situation. She estimated their rapid rate of descent, guessed their current altitude based on the atmospheric pressure, and calculated the exact number of minutes they had left before the oblivious passengers would begin to notice the undeniable plunge. Up in the completely isolated cockpit, Captain David Foster was currently experiencing the most horrifying 3 minutes of his entire long career. The primary digital flight displays had suddenly flickered back to life, but the glowing numbers they presented made absolutely no logical sense whatsoever. The digital altimeter boldly proclaimed they were flying level at 36,000 feet, while the vertical speed indicator insisted they were actually in a stable climb. According to the highly advanced central computers, the flight was proceeding in absolute perfection. But Foster could feel the terrifying truth deep in his aging bones that had absorbed decades of subtle aerodynamic shifts, telling him beyond a shadow of a doubt that his heavy airplane was falling out of the sky. He barked an urgent command to his frantic co-pilot, demanding a reading from the old analog backup altimeter. Stevens scrambled to locate the small mechanical instrument, which was half hidden behind a decorative side panel. When he finally read the tiny dial, all the blood instantly drained from his youthful face. He stammered in absolute horror that the mechanical backup showed they were currently passing through 28,000 feet and plunging rapidly. Foster closed his eyes tightly for one agonizing second, praying it was a hallucination. When he opened them again, his expression was that of a doomed man who had just comprehended the true, inescapable magnitude of their nightmare. The highly sophisticated flight control system was actively lying to them. The glowing digital screens swore everything was perfectly fine, but the physical reality was that the aircraft was hurtling toward the Earth. The central computer, the electronic brain responsible for managing every single aspect of the modern aircraft, was processing entirely fraudulent data. Even worse, the automated pilot system remained fully engaged, aggressively executing commands from a digital brain that had completely lost touch with the physical world. Foster screamed at Stevens to immediately disconnect the autopilot system. The terrified co-pilot aggressively slammed the glowing disconnect button multiple times, but the advanced computer flatly refused to relinquish its iron grip on the flight controls. Foster grabbed his heavy control yoke with both hands and pulled back with all his tremendous physical strength, desperately trying to manually force the nose of the airplane upward. The mechanical yoke remained completely frozen in place, feeling exactly as if it had been encased in solid, unbreakable concrete. The deranged computer had seized total, unyielding control of the massive machine, actively flying them into the ground, while its displays happily reported a smooth, level cruise. Down in the passenger cabin, the undeniable physical signs of the steep dive finally began to manifest. It started with something small. A silver ink pen rolled rapidly off a lowered tray table and clattered all the way down the sloped aisle toward the front bulkhead. Then, a half-empty plastic water bottle slid out from beneath a seat and skidded forward. The heavy fabric curtains dividing the classes swung forward at a sharp angle, hanging strangely in the pressurized air. A middle-aged engineer traveling with his wife was the very first person to break the illusion, pointing a trembling finger at the window and shouting that they were going down. The collective murmur of the cabin quickly morphed into a rising tide of genuine, unfiltered terror. Rachel Lawson, the deeply experienced chief flight attendant, marched bravely down the aisle, flashing a heavily practiced artificial smile, loudly announcing that they were merely experiencing a routine altitude adjustment. It was a desperate, well-intentioned lie. Rachel had already tried buzzing the locked cockpit door 4 times, and nobody had answered her frantic calls. Seated in row 7, Daisy watched the terrified flight attendant pass by, noting how the woman's lips smiled, but her wide, panicked eyes did not. Daisy had seen enough. She unbuckled her seatbelt with a sharp click, ignored the scolding voice of the elderly knitter next to her, and moved silently and swiftly toward the front of the plunging aircraft. She glided past weeping families, past businessmen frantically typing final text messages, and past Carter Brooks, who was currently standing up and loudly demanding to speak to the manager of the airline. Daisy completely ignored the wealthy man's arrogant screaming. She marched directly up to the heavily reinforced cockpit door, just as Rachel was lifting the intercom phone for a 5th desperate attempt. Daisy leaned in close and spoke with a low, commanding voice that left absolutely zero room for debate. She stated clearly that she was a fully licensed commercial pilot with thousands of hours of manual flight experience, that the aircraft was in an uncontrolled, fatal dive, and that she needed access to that cockpit immediately. Rachel stared at the young woman in the faded gray hoodie and cheap sneakers, her eyes full of profound disbelief. But when the aircraft suddenly violently shuddered again, dropping even steeper and causing overhead bins to burst open, Rachel made a split-second, heroic decision. She quickly punched the emergency override code into the keypad, and the heavy door clicked open. There are rare, defining moments in history where split-second decisions not only alter the course of a single life, but instantly dictate the ultimate fate of hundreds of innocent souls simultaneously. When Daisy forcefully pushed the heavy cockpit door open, the chaotic scene she discovered inside was significantly worse than her darkest, most pessimistic calculations. Captain David Foster was completely out of his seat, violently hauling on the frozen control yoke with his entire body weight, his uniform shirt completely drenched in dark, cold sweat, as he wrestled against the invisible, unyielding grip of the rogue computer. Beside him, co-pilot Frank Stevens was hyperventilating, frantically stabbing at a crowded panel of reset switches, his voice cracking as he shouted out a rapid-fire list of failed system reboots. The glowing digital displays surrounding them painted an utterly absurd, contradictory landscape of flight data, loudly insisting they were flying high and fast, while the tiny, hidden analog dial confirmed the terrifying reality of their deadly plummet toward the Earth. When Foster snapped his head around and saw Daisy standing in the doorway, his exhausted face registered pure, unadulterated shock. He demanded to know who she was and what she was doing in his secured cockpit. Daisy did not hesitate for a fraction of a second, immediately rattling off her name, her specific commercial cargo credentials, and her extensive history of flying fully manual, ancient aircraft through the deadliest weather conditions imaginable. She spoke with such rapid, highly technical, and flawless aeronautical precision that Foster did not even bother asking to see her physical pilot's license. Only a pilot who had truly bled for their wings could speak the complex language of aviation with such raw, undeniable authority. She stepped smoothly into the center of the cramped space, her sharp eyes scanning every single flashing light, every contradictory digital gauge, and every warning screen faster than the panicked men beside her could process. Then, her eyes locked onto a tiny, rapidly blinking amber light, tucked away in the bottom right corner of the main central console. In the incredibly dense technical manuals of this specific modern aircraft, that tiny amber light meant one highly specific, catastrophic thing: a severe data conflict between the primary flight modules. The two incredibly powerful central computers were receiving wildly different atmospheric readings from the external sensors. Instead of safely disconnecting and handing control back to the human pilots, the arrogant software had independently decided which sensor to believe, choosing the faulty data that falsely claimed the airplane was climbing far too steeply. In a misguided, fully automated attempt to prevent a stall, the computer was forcefully driving the nose of the plane toward the ground. The machine was not physically broken. It was simply horribly, logically confused, and because it believed it was saving them, it was fighting the human pilots to the death. Daisy took one deep, steadying breath, placed her hand firmly on the back of the captain's seat, and delivered a terrifying verdict in a voice that was eerily calm. She told the sweating captain that his airplane was not broken, but that the electronic brain was thoroughly convinced it was saving their lives, and the only possible way to stop the fatal dive was to completely kill the power to the central computers. The heavy silence that instantly filled the tiny cockpit following her statement was so thick and oppressive, it felt as though the atmospheric pressure had suddenly doubled. Frank Stevens was the very first person to violently object to the radical strategy. He screamed that turning off the flight computers mid-air was sheer lunacy, arguing wildly that doing so would instantly sever their digital navigation, their modern radio links, their automated engine thrust controls, and their vital hydraulic steering assistance. He hysterically claimed they would instantly become a massive, heavy brick, with useless wings falling out of the sky. Daisy did not flinch, nor did she retreat an inch in the face of his loud, panicked insubordination. She knew this was the exact same dismissive reaction she had faced her entire life, as a young woman in a deeply traditional, male-dominated industry. But the analog altimeter was winding down relentlessly, and gravity cared absolutely nothing for human egos or corporate flight protocols. She pointed a steady finger directly at the plunging analog needle and fired back, stating firmly that they were already flying a brick, just one that had a suicidal brain. She passionately argued that the massive jet engines still functioned, the aerodynamic wings were perfectly intact, and the heavy steel control cables running beneath the floorboards were entirely mechanical. The airplane desperately wanted to fly, but they had to blind the rogue computer first. Foster remained completely silent, his trembling hands still gripping the useless, frozen yoke. He looked deeply into Daisy's eyes, searching past her oversized gray hoodie and her remarkably young face. What he found staring back at him was not the arrogant overconfidence of youth, but rather the cold, forged steel of absolute, undeniable certainty. He asked her, in a voice stripped of all pride, how she could possibly be so sure. Daisy swallowed hard, allowing a brief flash of genuine vulnerability to cross her face, and confessed that she had spent her entire career flying ancient, terrifying cargo planes in Alaska that did not possess even a fraction of the digital safety nets this modern jet had. She explained that when a pilot is stripped of all computer assistance, they learn to truly feel the aircraft through the vibrations in the floorboards and the heavy tension in the cables. She looked Foster dead in the eye and whispered that his magnificent airplane was screaming in mechanical agony, begging to be flown manually. Foster closed his weary eyes for 3 long seconds. When he opened them, the crippling hesitation was completely gone. He barked a sharp, definitive order to his co-pilot to immediately locate the main circuit breakers for both primary flight data modules. Frank looked horrified, warning the captain that if they did this, they would be famous for all the wrong reasons by tomorrow morning. Foster coldly replied that if they did not do it right now, they would simply be dead. Shaking uncontrollably, Frank reached down into the dark lower panel and found the specific black cylindrical breakers. Daisy quickly dropped to her knees, verifying the tiny printed labels with her own eyes, and nodded her confirmation. She warned them both that the moment they pulled the breakers, the cockpit would go entirely dark, and the mechanical yoke would become incredibly heavy without hydraulic assistance, but it would finally be free. Foster nodded grimly, gripping the yoke tighter, and ordered Daisy to strap herself into the small jump seat located directly behind the center console. He needed her to act as his human computer, calling out the analog altitude and horizon readings second by second. Daisy swiftly buckled the 4-point harness over her hoodie. Foster took a massive, shuddering breath, braced his boots against the rudder pedals, and shouted the command to pull the breakers. 2 loud, sharp clicks echoed like gunshots in the confined space, and instantly, every single glowing digital screen in the cockpit died. The airplane plunged into absolute electronic darkness, leaving only the tiny, ancient mechanical dials glowing faintly in the shadows. But in that exact same terrifying fraction of a second, the heavy control yoke violently snapped free, and Foster finally felt the true, staggering weight of the falling aircraft in his hands. The sudden return of manual, mechanical control was physically overwhelming. At 22,000 feet, completely stripped of all modern digital assistance, Flight 943 transformed from a highly sophisticated marvel of modern engineering into an incredibly heavy, brutally stubborn beast of metal and wire. Captain Foster grunted loudly in raw physical pain as the tremendous aerodynamic forces slammed directly into his arms through the unassisted steel cables. He hauled fiercely back on the heavy yoke, utilizing every single ounce of muscle in his upper body to arrest the terrifying downward momentum. Slowly, agonizingly, the nose of the massive passenger jet began to pitch upward, fighting against the terrible gravity that had nearly claimed them. Sitting securely in the jump seat directly behind him, Daisy became the undisputed lifeline of the entire operation. Her clear, completely unwavering voice cut through the mechanical roaring of the cockpit, continuously reciting the crucial data from the tiny analog dials. She calmly announced that the descent had been successfully halted, calling out their stabilized altitude at 18,000 feet, and confirming that the tiny mechanical artificial horizon showed their wings were finally perfectly level. Co-pilot Stevens let out a long, ragged sound that hovered somewhere between a hysterical laugh and a broken sob, wiping cold sweat from his pale forehead. With the immediate fatal dive fully resolved, a new, incredibly daunting reality set in. They were flying completely blind in modern airspace, relying entirely on a basic magnetic compass and the physical sensations of the heavy airframe. Foster gritted his teeth against the burning strain in his shoulders and demanded to know where the closest airport, with a runway long enough to handle their heavy, unassisted landing, was located. Without hesitating for a single second, Daisy stated that Chicago Rockford International Airport was their absolute best option, boasting a massive runway designed for heavy cargo operations. Foster threw a glance over his straining shoulder, clearly deeply astonished that this young woman carried an encyclopedic knowledge of regional runway lengths strictly in her memory. Daisy offered a thin, modest smile, stating simply that cargo pilots memorized the long runways because their heavy, old planes frequently needed every single inch of concrete to stop safely. She rapidly calculated a new magnetic heading in her head, instructing Foster to turn gently to the west to intercept the approach path for Rockford. Meanwhile, Stevens frantically wrestled with the archaic backup radio system, desperate to establish contact with the outside world. Through an ocean of thick, crackling static, a faint, heavily distorted voice finally broke through the deafening white noise. It was an air traffic controller named Thomas, sitting in a dark radar room hundreds of miles away, who calmly confirmed he had their distressed aircraft painted clearly on his primary radar scope. Thomas's steady, professional voice informed them that he was immediately clearing all commercial traffic out of their way and vectoring them directly toward Rockford's longest runway. The sheer psychological relief of hearing a calm voice from the ground was immeasurable, but the physical reality inside the cockpit was rapidly deteriorating. The heavy, unassisted flight controls were exacting a brutal, unsustainable toll on the aging captain. Flying a massive commercial airliner manually, without hydraulic assistance, was identical to trying to steer a massive freight truck without power steering while moving at hundreds of miles per hour. Foster's thick forearms were visibly trembling, the prominent veins bulging dangerously against his skin, his breath coming in short, painful gasps. He had managed to keep them alive, but maintaining the incredibly delicate, micro-adjustments required to safely land the massive jet was rapidly exceeding his fading physical limits. Foster made a rapid, brutally honest calculation, the specific kind of deeply humbling assessment that truly defines a great leader. He realized with terrifying clarity that his exhausted arms would likely fail him during the critical, high-stress seconds of the final touchdown. He spoke over his shoulder, his voice strained with immense physical effort, asking Daisy exactly how many unassisted, purely manual landings she had executed in her career. Daisy answered honestly that she had long lost count, having spent years dropping heavy, unassisted cargo planes onto icy, wind-battered strips across the Alaskan wilderness. When Foster asked if she had ever landed a jet of this massive size, she admitted she had only done so in advanced simulators, but insisted that the core physics of feeling the heavy airframe remained exactly the same. Foster did not hesitate. He ordered his deeply shocked co-pilot out of the right seat. Stevens loudly protested, arguing frantically that allowing an unknown 25-year-old girl in a hoodie to manually land a crippled commercial jet was absolute madness. Foster aggressively shut him down, stating fiercely that he did not care what clothes she was wearing, only that she possessed the highly specific, raw manual flying skills that they currently lacked. Stevens reluctantly unbuckled and scrambled out of the way. Daisy smoothly slid into the co-pilot's seat, pulling the heavy four-point harness tightly across her chest. She wrapped her small, surprisingly strong hands around the right-side control yoke, immediately feeling the tremendous, terrifying weight of the massive aircraft pushing back against her muscles. She announced clearly that she had the flight controls, and the moment Foster let go, the airplane seemed to instantly recognize the firm, highly experienced touch of a pilot who truly understood how to fly by physical feel alone. Down in the crowded passenger cabin, the atmosphere was one of absolute, suffocating terror as the airplane descended rapidly into a thick, turbulent layer of dark storm clouds. The scratched plastic windows turned completely opaque, stripping the panicked passengers of their final remaining visual connection to the outside world. Rachel Lawson walked bravely through the violently shaking aisles, using a small yellow flashlight to check seatbelts, her voice repeating safety instructions like a desperate prayer. In row 12, Amanda huddled tightly over her crying 8-month-old baby, shielding the fragile infant with her own body. A few rows back, William, the elderly gentleman, calmly wrapped a worn wooden rosary around his wrinkled hands, closing his eyes and making a quiet, peaceful peace with whatever fate awaited him. Beside him, little Madison gripped her father's hand with terrifying strength, her wide eyes staring fixedly at the locked cockpit door, trusting blindly in the mysterious girl who had marched up there to save them. And sitting rigidly in the very first row, Carter Brooks was completely paralyzed, his expensive tablet lying dead on his lap. For the very first time in his highly privileged, incredibly wealthy existence, his vast fortune, his aggressive attitude, and his powerful corporate connections meant absolutely nothing. He was entirely at the mercy of the elements, trapped in a falling metal tube, entirely dependent on the skills of a young woman he had sneered at just hours before. Up in the cockpit, Daisy fought a brutal, exhausting war against the violent turbulence hiding inside the thick clouds. The heavy yoke violently jerked and bucked in her hands, desperately trying to throw the aircraft off balance. She ignored the deeply confusing signals from her own inner ear, locking her intense focus entirely on the tiny, bouncing mechanical artificial horizon dial. She used every ounce of her cargo flying experience to muscle the massive jet downward, perfectly maintaining their heading, waiting agonizingly for the exact moment they would finally break free from the blinding clouds and see the precious ground. The heavy, suffocating blanket of gray clouds finally tore open at precisely 3,000 feet, revealing the sprawling, rain-soaked landscape of northern Illinois rushing up to meet them. Daisy's sharp eyes instantly locked onto the long, beautiful slab of dark concrete waiting in the near distance, the primary runway of Chicago Rockford International Airport. Surrounded by a massive fleet of flashing red and blue emergency vehicles, the runway looked both incredibly welcoming and terrifyingly small. Through the crackling static of the backup radio, the air traffic controller, Thomas, delivered a grim, highly concerning weather update. He warned them that a strong, unseasonal storm front had shifted the local winds, meaning they would be forced to land with a massive 15-knot tailwind pushing aggressively against the back of the aircraft. Landing a heavy, fully manual jet with a strong tailwind was the absolute worst-case scenario, as the following wind would drastically increase their ground speed and chew up precious thousands of feet of concrete before they could stop. Captain Foster, currently serving as Daisy's extra set of eyes and hands, quickly asked her if she wanted to abort the approach, circle the airport, and attempt a highly difficult turn to land facing the wind. Daisy rapidly calculated the terrifying physics in her head. Attempting to maneuver the heavy, unassisted aircraft through a tight, low-altitude turn ran a massive risk of stalling the wings entirely. Furthermore, the sheer physical exhaustion of fighting the heavy yoke for another 15 minutes might cause her arms to completely fail. She stated firmly that they were fully committed to this approach, trusting that the extra-long cargo runway would provide just enough stopping distance if she managed to touch down on the very first painted brick. She tightened her grip on the heavy yoke, remembering the invaluable advice her gruff old instructor, Matthew, had given her years ago in a freezing Alaskan hangar. Hold the controls firmly enough that the airplane cannot escape, but gently enough that you can feel its metallic heartbeat. She barked the command to lower the landing gear. Without the automated hydraulic computers, Foster had to aggressively yank the heavy mechanical emergency release lever located on the floor panel. 3 tremendously loud, violent thuds echoed through the belly of the aircraft, vibrating through the floorboards, confirming that the heavy rubber tires had successfully dropped and locked into position. As they plummeted past 1,000 feet, the massive airplane began to wobble and violently drift, pushed relentlessly forward by the powerful, invisible tailwind. Down on the wet tarmac, a seasoned local paramedic named Sarah sat gripping the steering wheel of her idling ambulance, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched the massive, silent commercial jet dropping out of the low clouds, visibly swaying and fighting the wind as it approached the threshold. Daisy's intense concentration narrowed the entire chaotic universe down to a single, hyper-focused point. The bright white aiming markers painted on the wet concrete. She ordered Foster to carefully manage the physical throttle levers, needing exactly the right amount of raw engine thrust to keep them flying, without adding a single unnecessary knot of speed. The ground rushed up with terrifying velocity. At 100 feet above the concrete, the sheer scale of the massive runway details became hyper-real. Daisy could clearly see the individual blades of wet grass beside the tarmac and the intense flashing lights of the waiting fire trucks. She pulled back firmly on the heavy yoke, initiating the crucial landing flare, the incredibly delicate maneuver designed to lift the nose and soften the brutal impact with the earth. If she pulled too early, the heavy airplane would float helplessly down the runway, wasting the precious stopping distance they desperately needed. If she pulled too late, the massive main landing gear would slam into the concrete with enough devastating force to shatter the struts and spark a catastrophic fireball. After Daisy executed a flawless emergency landing, the damaged Embraer finally came to a stop on the rain-soaked runway. For a brief moment, silence filled the cabin before it erupted into overwhelming relief, with passengers embracing, crying, and celebrating their survival. Amanda held her sleeping baby close. William quietly thanked God, and even Carter Brooks, the once arrogant executive, could not hide a tear. In the cockpit, Captain Foster and co-pilot Stevens finally released the tension that had consumed them, while Daisy remained frozen until Foster gently assured her the ordeal was over. Only then did she break down, realizing she had finally been given the chance to prove her abilities. As passengers stepped into the fresh air, they no longer felt like strangers but a family of survivors. Emergency crews found that no one had suffered serious injuries, and news of Daisy's extraordinary landing quickly spread across the world. While airline executives debated the consequences, Foster fiercely defended Daisy, encouraging her to tell her own story before others distorted it. Daisy called her mother Ivy, who tearfully expressed her pride after learning her daughter had saved every life on board. At the press conference, Daisy humbly explained that her success came not from being extraordinary, but from years of relentless study and finally receiving the opportunity to demonstrate her skills. The federal investigation later confirmed that Daisy had made the correct decisions, uncovering a critical manufacturing defect that threatened many aircraft worldwide. Her actions led to the grounding and repair of the affected fleet, saving countless future lives. Although the airline offered her a prestigious promotion, Daisy accepted only after the company agreed to fund a scholarship program for disadvantaged rural students, later named the Pikeville Program. Captain Foster declared that the proudest moment of his career was trusting a better pilot to save everyone. The experience transformed the lives of many passengers and crew members, inspiring new dreams, deeper gratitude, and lasting humility. Even Carter Brooks quietly made an anonymous donation that funded dozens of flight scholarships, identified only by the note Seat 7C. Daisy eventually returned home to Pikeville, where her mother welcomed her with pride, knowing her daughter had found her true place in the sky. Her story became a lasting reminder that genuine courage, talent, and resilience are often hidden behind humble appearances, and that true heroes are ordinary people who simply receive the chance to prove what they are capable of when the moment finally arrives.